Today, I'm going to take you on a thrilling ride through the eerie corridors of a mystery horror film from 2016 titled The Boy. Be warned, there are spoilers ahead, so proceed with caution. The story begins with a car winding its way through the picturesque yet desolate British countryside. In the back seat, an American woman named Greta Evans lies asleep, her journey to a new life taking its toll on her. She's startled awake by the driver as they finally arrive at the mansion where she will be working, a grand yet haunting estate. The driver informs her that the house owners had to step out briefly and advises her to wait for them in the parlor. As Greta steps into the house, she removes her shoes, leaving them neatly by the entrance, next to her luggage. The house is eerily silent, the kind of silence that feels almost unnatural. Suddenly, a faint noise comes from upstairs. Curiosity piqued, Greta cautiously ascends the staircase. As she explores, she comes across a painting, a portrait of a couple with their young son. This must be the family she's been hired to work for, she thinks to herself. Further down the hallway, she stumbles upon a child's room. The room is quaint and filled with toys, as if waiting for its little owner to return. Greta picks up one of the toys, examining it closely, when she's suddenly startled by a voice behind her. A man has appeared out of nowhere, greeting her warmly. He introduces himself as Malcolm, the local grocery boy, and explains that he makes regular deliveries to the estate. Greta, still reeling from the surprise, accepts Malcolm's offer to show her around the kitchen. As they work together, putting away groceries, they engage in light conversation. Malcolm easily guesses that Greta is American and speculates that she might be running away from something or someone. Greta, not wanting to delve into her past, quickly changes the subject, asking him about the family she's about to work for. Malcolm describes them as nice and generous, but when she inquires about the son, Malcolm hesitates, his usual jovial demeanor faltering. He struggles to find the words to describe the boy, and before he can say more, they're interrupted. Mrs. Heelshire, the lady of the house, enters the room, her presence commanding attention. She immediately notices Greta's bare feet and questions why she isn't wearing any shoes. Flustered, Greta returns to the entrance to retrieve them, but to her shock, they're no longer where she left them. Mrs. Heelshire reassures her, saying that it must be her son playing a little prank, and suggests that the shoes will likely turn up soon. Greta, now wearing different shoes, follows Mrs. Heelshire through the house. In another room, Mr. Heelshire is having a quiet conversation with his son, Brahms, who remains hidden behind a large armchair. As Mrs. Heelshire and Greta join them, Greta prepares herself to meet the boy, but when the figure in the chair is revealed, she's taken aback. Sitting there, instead of a child, is a life-sized porcelain doll. Greta chuckles nervously, thinking this must be some kind of joke, but the Heelshires remain solemn. The gravity of the situation slowly dawns on her. Malcolm returns briefly, and to Greta's surprise, he interacts with the doll as if it were a real boy. His nonchalant behavior encourages Greta to do the same. She cautiously approaches the doll, extending her hand, and says she hopes they can be friends. Mrs. Heelshire seems satisfied with this interaction and instructs Mr. Heelshire to bring Greta's belongings upstairs while she continues showing Greta the ropes. As they make their way upstairs, Mrs. Heelshire explains that they've gone through several nannies before, but none of them were quite right for Brahms. Greta, she adds, is younger and prettier than the others. Perhaps that's why Brahms has taken an immediate liking to her. Once in Brahms' room, Mrs. Heelshire walks Greta through the boy's daily routine. Brahms must be woken up every morning at precisely 7 a.m., dressed in clean clothes and ready for his lessons. Mrs. Heelshire instructs Greta to demonstrate how she would change Brahms, but when Greta fumbles a bit, Mrs. Heelshire steps in, showing her the exact way it should be done. Next, they move to the study where Brahms' lessons take place. His education is very regimented. 3 hours of study, 5 days a week, beginning with poetry, followed by music appreciation. The music, Mrs. Heelshire emphasizes, must be played loudly. Brahms enjoys it that way. Later, they sit down for dinner. The atmosphere is tense, with the doll sitting in its own chair at the table. When they finish eating, Greta starts clearing the plates, but Mrs. Heelshire stops her, explaining that nothing goes to waste here in the countryside. Leftovers are always saved in the freezer for emergencies. Mr. Heelshire then takes Greta outside to check on the traps set around the garden. They catch rats, a grim necessity in such a large, old house. As they walk through the grounds, Mr. Heelshire shares more about the house's history, including the fact that all the windows have been permanently shut. He speaks cryptically about his son, hinting that despite appearances, Brahms is very much present with them. Greta, eager to make a good impression, assures him that she understands. That evening, the Heelshires put Brahms to bed and pray together as a family, including Greta in their prayers. Mrs. Heelshire asks Greta for a moment of privacy with her son, so Greta waits outside while the family has their final private moments together. Shortly after, the couple emerges and informs Greta that Brahms has chosen her to be his nanny, if she'll accept the position. Greta agrees, and Mrs. Heelshire embraces her, whispering an apology in her ear. Greta retires to her room, feeling unsettled by the day's events. She calls her sister, Sandy, back in the States to share the oddity of her situation. She mentions the lack of Wi-Fi and cell signal, adding to her sense of isolation. Sandy, however, encourages Greta to stick it out, reminding her that this job is exactly what she needed to escape her troubled past. Sandy also confides that Greta's ex-boyfriend, Cole, has been harassing her, even showing up at her house unannounced, but she assures Greta that she hasn't revealed her whereabouts. The next morning, Greta is awakened by strange noises. She finds Mrs. Heelshire sternly scolding Brahms for making a mess with his toys. Mr. Heelshire, seeing Greta watching from the hallway, apologizes for the family's haste in leaving, explaining that it's been years since they've taken a vacation and they're eager to go. He hands Greta a list of strict rules she must follow every day, emphasizing their importance. As they prepare to leave, Mr. Heelshire makes a cryptic remark to Greta, telling her to be good to Brahms, or else. He doesn't get to finish his sentence, as Mrs. Heelshire interrupts, but the implication is clear. This job comes with unseen dangers. Greta, trying to remain professional, assures them she will care for Brahms as if he were her own. The couple then leaves, and Greta finds herself alone in the house with the doll. Greta, unsettled by the doll, decides not to follow the rules immediately. She places Brahms on a chair, covers him with a blanket, and goes to the kitchen to make herself a sandwich. She settles into a comfy chair with a glass of wine and a magazine, eventually drifting off to sleep. When she wakes, it's dark outside. As she gets up to take her tray to the kitchen, she notices that the blanket covering Brahms has slipped off. She's spooked by this, but dismisses it, thinking she must have imagined things. She takes Brahms to his room and carelessly tosses him onto a rocking chair before heading to bed herself. That night, Greta is jolted awake by the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the house. She cautiously investigates, and as she approaches the family portrait hanging on the wall, she's suddenly grabbed by a hand reaching out of the painting. She wakes up in bed, gasping, realizing it was just a nightmare. Shaken, Greta goes to check on Brahms. She finds him exactly where she left him, but notices a drip of water on his face. Nervously, she wonders if the doll could possibly be crying, but quickly realizes it's just water from a leak in the ceiling. She moves Brahms to the bed to keep him dry and decides to explore more of the house. In the attic, Greta finds a locked door and tries to pry it open with a fire poker, but it's no use. She spends the rest of the day trying to keep herself busy, making another unsuccessful attempt to call her sister. As soon as she hangs up, the phone rings, but all she hears is static on the other end. The eerie atmosphere continues to build up. The next day, Greta is outside collecting the mail when Malcolm arrives with groceries. They chat as they put the food away, and Greta expresses her frustration that no one warned her about Brahms being a doll. Malcolm, somewhat sheepishly, admits he didn't want to spoil the surprise. Greta presses him for more information about the doll's backstory, and Malcolm reluctantly takes her to a grave near the house. It's revealed that the real Brahms died in a house fire on his 8th birthday, and the doll appeared shortly after his death. Malcolm tries to reassure Greta, saying he knows it's all very strange, but insists it's harmless. Greta does the math and realizes the Heelshires have been living with this delusion for 20 years. Malcolm adds that the couple had been searching for a nanny for a year before Greta came along. He offers to take her out for a night on the town, promising to keep it a secret, and Greta, needing a break from the eerie atmosphere, agrees, though she insists it's not a date. As they speak, unbeknownst to them, Brahms is listening through the walls, his presence lingering in the shadows of the house. Later, Greta is on the phone with Sandy again, discussing her upcoming outing with Malcolm. Sandy teases her, suggesting it sounds like a date, but Greta remains adamant that it's nothing more than a distraction. Before heading out, Greta notices Brahms staring at her from the other room. Feeling unnerved, she shuts the door. When she goes to the bathroom to shower, she's completely unaware that someone, or something, is in the room with her. When she finishes her shower, she finds her dress and necklace missing, and a chunk of her hair has been cut off. Panicked, she searches her room, discovering that all her drawers have been opened and her clothes are gone. In a state of fear, Greta stumbles upon the attic door, now mysteriously open. She grabs the fire poker and cautiously climbs inside. The door slams shut behind her, trapping her in the darkness. Hearing a car outside, she rushes to the window and sees Malcolm knocking on the front door. She tries to make noise to get his attention, but he doesn't hear her. Desperate, she attempts to break the window with the poker, but only manages to snap the tool in half. As Malcolm leaves, Greta is left alone, panic rising. Wandering through the attic, Greta is startled by a shadow and collapses, hitting her head. When she wakes the next morning, she realizes the shadow was just a pile of clothes. As she explores further, she finds an old photo album filled with pictures of Brahms as a child. Among them is the portrait she had seen earlier, though in the photograph, Brahms appears far more serious. Suddenly, the attic door swings open on its own, and Greta cautiously descends, returning to her room to find all her clothes have been neatly returned, hanging around the furniture. Later, Malcolm arrives to help her search the house for intruders, but they find no sign of a break-in. Trying to ease her fears, Malcolm decides to stay a while, and they play a game of pool. As they play, Greta presses Malcolm for more information about the real Brahms. He hesitates, but eventually shares what he knows. There are two stories about Brahms in the town. The polite version paints him as a good kid, while the pub talk describes him as strange and unsettling. Malcolm recounts the day he came to the house to deliver a birthday present, only to find the Heelshires grieving with the doll. Mr. Heelshire, despondent, confided in Malcolm that Brahms was always odd. After ensuring Greta is okay on her own, Malcolm leaves, but not before expressing his concern for her safety. Alone in her room, Greta tries to call Sandy again, but instead gets a disturbing call from Cole, who has somehow tracked her down. Shaken, she resolves to follow the rules more strictly. The next morning, Greta is jolted awake by strange noises. She finds her lost shoes outside her door, a sign that something or someone is messing with her. Brahms, now sitting on the edge of his bed, has the list of rules laid out beside him. Greta finally understands that Brahms only wants her to follow the rules. She begins to obey them diligently, except for the goodnight kiss, which she still can't bring herself to give. Days pass, and Greta's routine becomes centered around caring for Brahms. Malcolm continues to visit, growing increasingly concerned as Greta becomes more engrossed in her duties. One day, she asks Brahms for a sign, and when she leaves the room, she hears a noise. Brahms has moved on his own. Later, Greta demonstrates this to Malcolm, showing him that Brahms only moves when no one is watching. They draw a chalk outline around the doll and leave the room. When they return, Brahms is no longer in the same spot. Malcolm, now convinced, is stunned. As they sit and talk, Greta opens up about her abusive ex, Cole, and the trauma of losing her pregnancy. Malcolm finally understands why this strange situation means so much to her, and they share a kiss. But their moment of intimacy is interrupted by the sound of music blasting through the house. They find the record player spinning on its own, with Brahms sitting nearby. Greta puts Brahms back to bed, while Malcolm urges her to leave the house for the night. Greta refuses, determined to stay. Malcolm then tells her the story of Emily Cribbs, a little girl who used to play with Brahms before she was found dead near the house on the same day it burned down. The killer was never found. Despite this chilling tale, Greta remains resolute, refusing to leave Brahms alone. The following day, Greta finds Cole has broken into the house. He tries to persuade her to return to him, but Greta is firm in her refusal. That night, Cole is awakened by rats crawling on him and a message scrawled on the wall in red, "Get out." Brahms sits nearby, seemingly watching the scene unfold. Enraged, Cole grabs the doll and starts smashing it, despite Greta and Malcolm's desperate pleas to stop. Suddenly, the walls begin to shake, and a hidden passage opens, revealing a grown man wearing a porcelain mask. The real Brahms, alive and calling out to Greta with the same childlike voice she heard on the phone. Brahms attacks Cole, killing him, and then turns on Greta. Malcolm tries to fight him off, but Brahms is relentless. Greta and Malcolm flee through the house, trying to escape Brahms' wrath. They eventually find a hidden room where Brahms has been living, filled with all the necessities and more. Greta discovers a doll made to resemble her, along with a letter from the Heelshires, saying they're not coming back and that Brahms can have the girl. In a final showdown, Greta returns to the house, armed with a screwdriver. She confronts Brahms, using her authoritative nanny voice to command him back to bed. Brahms, hesitant but obedient, complies. When he demands a goodnight kiss, Greta leans in, using the opportunity to stab him with the screwdriver. Brahms retaliates, nearly choking Greta, but she manages to push the screwdriver deeper and Brahms collapses, revealing his scarred face as his mask shatters. Greta rushes to find Malcolm, and together, they escape the house, finally free from the nightmare. The film ends with a haunting image of a pair of hands, similar to Brahms, gluing the shattered doll back together.